The women were waiting for the punishment to begin. That was the thought running through their minds as the truck stopped inside Camp Hearn, Texas, in the summer of 1944. The gate opened. Quite as native after 12 German women stepped down into the heat. Their uniforms hung loosely from bodies weakened by months of war. Their faces were tired. Their hands shook. They had crossed an ocean as prisoners, carrying not only the fear of captivity, but the stories they had been told since childhood. America was supposed to be cruel. Americans were supposed to hate them. The enemy was supposed to make them suffer. But standing in front of them was a Texas rancher named Clayton Reese. He looked at the women. He looked at the condition they were in, and instead of giving them an order, he removed his hat and shook his head. "They're too thin to work." For the women, those words were almost impossible to understand. They were prisoners. Ugh, that was the rule of war. But this American man had looked past the uniform, past the flag they had served, and seen something else. A birth, and that decision would change the lives of 12 women who thought their future had already been decided. To understand why an Texas rancher would risk criticism from the army to protect enemy prisoners, we have to go back 1 year, to a battlefield thousands of miles away. In 1943, Horse Recon campaign was collapsing. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was being pushed back across the desert. Our British and American forces advanced through Tunisia, capturing entire formations. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian troops surrendered. Among them were 12 women. They were not frontline soldiers. They had not stormed beaches or fired machine guns. They were nurses, clerks, and radio operators. They had supported the German war machine, but many had never directly fought anyone. To the American military, however, the distinction was simple. They wore German uniforms. They belonged to the enemy. The women entered captivity terrified. Their fear was not accidental. For years, Nazi propaganda had created a powerful image of America as a ruthless enemy. They had been told that capture meant humiliation, starvation, and endless suffering. One of the women later remembered lying awake during her first night as a prisoner, convinced that her life was over. They expected cruelty. Instead, they received something far more confusing. Basic human treatment, food, water, medical attention. The first cracks appeared in the story they had believed their entire lives. The journey to America took them across thousands of miles of ocean. They boarded a transport ship and descended below deck into a world of steel walls, darkness, and constant vibration. At night, the engines were so loud that conversation became impossible. The ship moved through dangerous waters where German submarines still hunted Allied vessels. For the women, every sound carried fear. But then came another surprise. The food, parties, coffee, simple meals, and nothing luxurious, but more than many German civilians were receiving at home. A piece of bread became a symbol of something they struggled to understand. If this was how America treated prisoners, then what else had they been lied to about? When the ship reached the United States, the women saw a country they never expected. The ports were enormous. Factories stretched into the distance. Ships filled the horizon. Then Unthinkable fled as weak appeared, almost impossible to defeat. The war had barely touched American soil. The train carried them across the country. Through the windows, they watched endless farmland, our small towns, and ordinary life continuing far away from the destruction of Europe. Then they reached Texas. The landscape changed. The land became wider. The war felt distant, but the women were still prisoners. At Camp Hearn, thousands of German prisoners lived behind fences and guard towers. The system was strict. The rules were clear. Prisoners could work. They could earn credits. They could support the American labor shortage. Because in 1944, America had a problem. The country had millions of men fighting overseas. Farms and ranches were running out of workers. Crops needed harvesting. Animals needed care. Fences needed repairing. Dead land, but fewer. That was where Clayton Reese entered the story. Reese was not a politician. He was not a military officer. He was a rancher. His 4,000-acre property demanded constant work. Before the war, he had sons and hired hands helping him. how his sons were overseas, and many of his workers had left for better paying war industries. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed fixing. The grass kept growing, or did not stop nature. On Turney, Reese saw a notice offering prisoner labor. He needed help, so he went to Camp Hearn. But when he saw the 12 women standing in front of him, his expectations changed. He expected workers. Instead, he saw exhaustion. Their uniforms looked too large. Their faces were hollow. They looked less like farm laborers and more like patients leaving a hospital. The army officer supervising the transfer explained the rules. The women were prisoners. They were there to work. Reese listened. Then he looked back at them. He imagined them standing in the Texas sun for 10 hours. He imagined the heat, the physical demands, the possibility that they would collapse before completing a single day. He made his decision. They're too thin to work. The officer disagreed. The paperwork said they were available. The system needed labor. But Reese saw the problem differently. A broken worker was not useful. A human being had to be rebuilt before they could contribute. So he made a proposal. Let me take them. Let me help them regain their strength. Then they can work. The request was unusual. The army wanted productivity. Reese wanted preparation. After some hesitation, permission was granted. That night, Reese returned home and explained everything to his wife. Ruth. She understood. These women are from home. Enemy had lost years of their lives to a war they did not control. But there was another problem. How do you rebuild someone who has spent months expecting cruelty? The answer came from Reese's foreman, Otto Kissler. He suggested horses. Some of the women came from rural Germany. Some had experience with animals. Perhaps work could restore more than their physical strength. Perhaps it could restore confidence. So the plan changed. The prisoners would not begin with exhausting field labor. They would learn the ranch. They would learn horses. They would learn how to trust again. Field after, the women returned to the ranch. They expected fields. They expected difficult labor. Instead, they saw a corral. Inside were horses. But for several seconds, nobody moved. They searched for the hidden punishment, the trick they were sure would follow. But there was nothing. Only animals. Only open land. Only a man telling them they could learn something new. One woman stepped forward. Her name was before the war. She had taught children to ride in Germany. She approached a horse named Biscuit. Slowly, carefully, she placed her and against the animal's neck. And then she cried, because she was afraid. Because for the first time in a long time, she remembered who she had been before becoming a prisoner. She was not a number. She was not an enemy. She was a person. And that was the first day the 12 women began a journey nobody expected. They came to Texas believing they had been captured by monsters. They were about to discover something far more complicated. The first lessons were the women learned how to brush the horses, clean the stalls, carry supplies, and move slowly around animals that could sense fear. The ranch hand showed them patience. Ruth showed them kindness. Every morning, the women arrived still wearing the identity forced upon them by war. Enemy prisoners. But every afternoon, they left having done something normal, something human. Over time, they grew stronger. Their faces changed. Their uniforms began to fit differently. The women who had arrived weak and frightened started standing taller. Then came the saddles. Riding was not easy. The first attempts were full of fear. Hands gripped reins too tightly. Our bodies became stiff. Every movement of the horse created uncertainty. But slowly, the women learned. They learned balance. They learned control. They learned that the animal beneath them was not an enemy. It was a partner. One young woman named Derica eventually rode without assistance. At first, she could barely control her nerves. But after several circles around the field, something changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her expression softened. For a few minutes, she forgot she was a prisoner. That moment mattered, because the greatest damage of war is not always physical. Sometimes it is the belief that you no longer have control over your own life. The ranch gave that control back. By autumn, the women were doing real work. They checked fences, moved cattle, helped maintain the property. The army recorded every task. every assignment. On paper, it was simply prisoner labor. But something unusual was happening. The prisoners were becoming healthier. They were becoming more confident. And there were no escape attempts. Eventually, the arrangement attracted attention. Adolf Hitler, Franklin Coates, and military officials visited the ranch expecting to find problems. Instead, they found something they did not understand. German prisoners working peacefully beside American ranchers. Women who had once been terrified, now riding horses across Axis land. The officers asked the obvious question. Were there discipline problems? The answer challenged everything they assumed. The system was built around control. But this worked because it was built around dignity. Then came Christmas. Fries had an idea. The women had been away from home for years. Henny would never see their old lives again. She wanted to give them one evening that did not feel like war. A real meal. A celebration. A birthday to remind that they were still human. The request moved through military channels. Eventually, permission was granted, but conditions. The guards had to be present. Rules had to be followed. But on Christmas Eve, 12 German women, they saw a warm fire. They'd heard a table filled with food. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. They were prisoners. The Reeses were Americans. Their countries were still at war. But then people began talking. They shared stories. They exchanged songs. One of the women taught an old German Christmas song. Soon, even an American guard joined in, struggling through the unfamiliar words. For one evening, the war disappeared, and not because the conflict was forgotten, but because the people inside that room remembered something larger than the conflict. They remembered they were human beings. Then 1945 arrived, and reality returned. Artismave of Austria-Germany was collapsing. The women began receiving letters from home. The news was devastating. Some discovered their homes had been destroyed. Some learned family members were missing. The war they had supported had destroyed the world they knew. The ranch became their refuge. When Ingrid received terrible news about her old riding school in Germany, she stopped speaking for days. Then one morning, she walked to Biscuit's stall. She brushed the horse slowly. The familiar smell of hay and leather surrounded her. Little by little, she returned to herself. The horse had become more than an animal. It represented a connection to the person she had been before the war. By spring, Germany surrendered. That had shaped every part of their lives was ending. But another uncertainty began. What would happen to them? Where would they go? Would they ever see the people who had helped them again? The answer came later that year. The prisoner labor program ended. The women would return to Europe. Before leaving, the Reeses held one final dinner. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic ceremony, just food, conversation, a quiet goodbye. The women gave small gifts, but handmade objects, memories. Ingrid gave Ruth an address in Germany. If you ever come, she said, find me. They both knew it might never happen, but the promise mattered. On their final day in Texas, Reese allowed the women one last ride. They crossed the pasture beneath a wide blue sky. The horses moved slowly. The grass brushed against their boots. The women tried to remember every detail. The sound of hoofs, the wind, the feeling of the reins in their hands, because they knew they were leaving behind the place where they had started becoming themselves again. When the truck finally arrived, they looked back at the ranch, the house, the corral, fields, the place where enemy had somehow become something else. Friends, the women returned to a devastated Europe, but they carried Texas with them. Ingrid reopened a riding school. Akada became a teacher. Others rebuilt their lives from the ruins of war. They never forgot the rancher who looked at 12 enemy prisoners and saw something more. Clayton Reese never commanded an army. He never changed the outcome of a battle. His name would not appear beside famous generals or major campaigns. But in one small corner of Texas, during one of history's darkest wars, he made a different kind of decision. He chose not to see the enemy first. He chose to see the person. And years later, in an old photograph kept by the Reese family, both women stand beside their horses beneath the Texas sky. They are no longer afraid. They are no longer just prisoners. They are 12 human beings who found, for a brief moment in history, a place where war could not reach them. The war had taught millions of people one simple lesson. Never. By the summer of 1944, 12 German women arrived at a prisoner camp in Texas carrying that fear with them. They had been told what America was, a country of cruelty. Our prisoners disappeared behind fences, forgotten by the world. They expected punishment. They expected hatred. Instead, when the truck stopped inside Camp Hearn, a rancher looked at their exhausted faces and said the one thing they never expected to hear from an enemy. They had to thin to work. It was not an insult. It was not a threat. It was concern. And for 12 women who had spent years seeing the world divided into enemies and allies, that single sentence created a crack in everything they believed. Because sometimes the most powerful battles of war are not fought with weapons. They are fought inside the human mind. The battle between fear and trust, between what someone has been taught to believe and what they finally see with their own eyes. This is the story of 12 German prisoners who arrived in America expecting the worst and found themselves learning something far more complicated, that even in the middle of history as greatest war, humanity could survive in the most unlikely places. To understand how a Texas ranch became a place where enemies learned to trust each other, we have to return to North Africa in 1943. The German war machine was collapsing. The campaign that had once promised victory across the desert was turning into disaster. Allied forces pushed forward through Tunisia, capturing entire units as German resistance finally broke. Among the thousands of prisoners taken were 12 women. They were not frontline soldiers. They had never stormed beaches or fired machine guns. They were nurses, clerks, and radio operators, women who had supported the German military system from behind the battlefield. But to the Americans who captured them, the uniform mattered. They were enemies, and to the women themselves, capture meant something terrifying. Coyotes. Nazi propaganda had described the Allies as monsters. They had been told Americans would humiliate them, starve them, and treat them. The first night as prisoners was filled with uncertainty. They did not know where they were going. They did not know what waited ahead. Most importantly, they did not know whether the world they had been told about was real. One of the women later remembered the strange confusion of that moment. They had prepared themselves for cruelty, so when American guards spoke calmly, it felt suspicious. Kindness seemed impossible. They waited for the punishment that the women were eventually placed aboard a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Below deck, surrounded by steel walls and the constant vibration of engines, they began a journey into a country they had only known through enemy propaganda. The ship carried them thousands of miles across open water. At night, the engines shook the entire vessel. During the day, they saw something that challenged everything they believed. American ships moving, factories producing supplies. Adolf Hitler fled his native Austria, a nation untouched by the destruction that had consumed Europe. When they finally reached American soil, the first shock was not military. It was ordinary life. Through train windows, these Deutsches Austria, they saw farms, towns, bars, and people living with a sense of security that felt almost impossible. They saw food. They saw abundance. They saw a country that was fighting a war but had not been destroyed by it. For women who had spent years living with shortages and fear, America looked almost unreal. Eventually, their train carried them south, toward Texas, toward Camp Hearn. The camp was part of a massive prisoner system created by the United States during World War II. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners would pass through American camps. Most were captured soldiers. These 12 women were different. They were, and that difference made them a mystery. They arrived carrying the weight of everything they had lost. Their country was fighting a war it was increasingly unable to win. Their future was uncertain, and now they were prisoners thousands of miles from home. But outside the camp fences, another crisis was unfolding. America needed workers. The war had taken millions of men away from farms and ranches. Across Texas, fields needed harvesting. Fences needed repairing. Cattle needed managing. The land continued demanding attention, even while the people who had cared for it were gone. One man felt that problem every morning. His name was Clayton Reese. He was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He was a rancher. A practical man who understood simple things. Animals needed feeding. Fences needed fixing. Work. His ranch stretched across thousands of acres of Texas land. Before the war, he had workers. He had family helping. And now many of them were gone. Some were fighting overseas. Others had left for factories producing weapons and equipment. The cattle did not care about the war. The grass kept growing. The fences kept breaking. And Reese needed help. When he heard that prisoners from Camp Hearn could be assigned agricultural work, he paid attention. At first, he expected soldiers, men who could handle hard labor. Instead, he discovered the army had something unusual. 12 German women. The paperwork described them simply: enemy personnel, available for agricultural labor. But when Reese visited Camp Hearn, the reality was different. The women standing in front of him did not look like workers. Their uniforms hung loosely from their bodies. Their faces were thin. Their hands showed exhaustion. Some were still recovering from years of war and deprivation. They looked less like farm laborers and more like patients who needed care. Friedhof Hiss studied them quietly. He imagined those women standing beneath the Texas sun. Hours of work, heavy tools, or long days, the same heat that could exhaust healthy men. Then he made his decision. They are too thin to work. The camp officials were surprised. The army needed labor. Rules were rules. Prisoners worked. That was how the system operated. But Reese saw something the paperwork did not. The army saw 12 prisoners. He saw 12 human beings. He explained that sending them immediately into the fields would achieve nothing. They would collapse. They would become sick. The work would fail. A healthier prisoner was a more useful prisoner. It was a practical argument, but behind it was something deeper. He refused to ignore what was standing in front of him. The camp commander eventually allowed Reese to take responsibility for them. But there was still a problem. How do you rebuild people who have spent years living in fear? Reese discussed it with his wife, Ruth. She understood something important. These women did not only need food. They needed dignity. They needed to feel useful again. Then another idea appeared. The horses. The open land. Instead of forcing them into exhausting field labor, Reese decided they would learn ranch work. They would ride. They would care for animals. They would become part of the land. It was an unusual choice. These were, and he was giving them something prisoners rarely received: trust. Avils later, the truck arrived at the ranch. The women stepped down expecting fields. Instead, they saw horses, animals waiting in the morning light. They stood completely still. They searched for the hidden punishment, the cruelty they had been expecting. But there was nothing. Only horses. Only quiet. Only a rancher telling them they could learn. For the first time since their capture, someone had given them a choice. One woman named, before the war, she had known horses. When she approached a mare named Biscuit, she placed her hand against the animal's neck, and she cried, not because she was afraid, because for a moment she remembered who she had been before the war, before the uniform, before the prisoner number, before becoming someone the world saw only as an enemy. The transformation did not happen overnight. The women were still prisoners. The guards remained nearby. Rules still existed. The war had not disappeared. But something inside the ranch had changed. Every morning, they returned. They learned how to brush horses, how to repair equipment, how to move calmly around animals. Our small skills, as simple tasks, but after years of being controlled by fear, those small things mattered. A horse does not respond to anger. It responds to patience. The women discovered that trust was not weakness. It was something built slowly, ride by ride. As their health improved, their confidence returned. They began learning real ranch work. They checked fences. They helped move cattle. They understood the land. The same women who had arrived unable to imagine their future were now crossing Texas fields on horseback. The guards noticed. So did the army. Eventually, officers visited the ranch expecting problems. They expected escape attempts, discipline, complaints. Instead, they found something completely different: healthy prisoners. The sky here's successful war. No violence. No resistance. The system had produced a result nobody expected. Treating people with dignity had made them more willing to cooperate. Then came Christmas, and that was when the experiment became something more. Ruth believed the women needed one normal evening, one moment where they were not prisoners, or not in peace, just people. The army approved the gathering under strict conditions. Guards would remain present. The rules would be followed. But on Christmas Eve, the 12 women entered the Reese home. They found a warm room, a decorated tree, a doll filled with food. For many of them, it was the first peaceful holiday they had experienced in years. First, nobody knew what to say. The room contained people who technically belonged to opposing sides. Americans and Germans, captors and prisoner. But then someone began singing. Adolf. Slowly, others joined. The language that had once separated them became something shared. For a few minutes, the war disappeared, and not because the conflict was forgotten, not because the suffering was erased, but because human connection was stronger than the labels placed on them. Then reality returned. From Europe began arriving. The women learned what had happened to their families. Dedos, Bonn, Tendorf. One woman received news that her hometown